Marc Marquez is suddenly 22 points clear at the top of the MotoGP standings. He's 22 points clear of Alex Marquez. He's 51 points clear of teammate Pecco Bagnaia. There's still so much of the championship left to go. But Simon, do you have the gut feeling, like maybe I do, that we've seen the last MotoGP Championship League change of the season?
I mean, it's looking harder and harder to see this swing in another way. The problem with Marc Marquez, the thing that we've always seen from him over the course of however many championship wins in the past, is that once you kind of let him build up a head of steam, get some momentum going, it's just really, really difficult to stop that. The only way I can see really significant championship league changes now is if we keep seeing Marc Marquez mistakes. But I mean, my gut feeling is that the worst of those are probably behind us as he continues this, adaptation process to the new bike and figures where it works and where it doesn't work. And from here on, you kind of have to think that there's going to be an element of just cruising out a lead to the point where it sits kind of above the margin where it doesn't really matter what happens. If he falls off around, it doesn't really make any difference because he'll just extend the lead out again over the next few, to the point where, we inevitably see him pick up the championship with a fairly comfortable, healthy number of races left in the 2025 season.
It's paradoxical, isn't it? Because it's not like we consider Marc to be stronger on the European tracks than the overseas ones that kick off the season. But I think we've seen MotoGP seasons like this already. I think maybe 2017 with, against Marc Marquez on the Yamaha, Andrea Dovizioso on the Ducati, where he'd sort of get the mistakes out of the way early. And you look at the standings and he's actually in a bit of a hole. And then the European season starts and just the points keep coming in and coming in and coming in. And there's a feeling that he's hit that mode again here, isn't there? In the way that he allowed himself to score the points that he needed to score at Le Mans.
Yeah, I think Le Mans was the kind of the perfect example because we saw him essentially settling for a healthy, comfortable second place and letting Johan Zarco do his thing at the front. I don't for a second doubt that Marquez couldn't have pushed harder and that, the gap was realistically 20 plus seconds at the checkered flag. I think that at that point he was simply managing the gap to those around him, especially once he realized that his two on paper biggest title contenders were essentially out of it. From that point on, Marquez knew safe points, second place. For such a manic, confusing day to walk away with 20 points, that's a job well done. And that's the sort of thing that he kind of has to do because of the start to the season he's had, because of those mistakes he's made. But, I mean, you just, you made the comparison, Val, to 2017. For me, we're in 2019 mode where he's just not going to finish off the podium this year. It's so comfortable for him at this point that he can just cruise to easy victories, or there's something not quite right in the system and we see him make a mistake and fall off. And there's really nothing else in between. And you almost think that maybe there's even an element of those mistakes coming from some sort of complacency because of how he's basically playing the season on easy mode, it looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it's not easy for him, but I know what you mean. In the later part of races, especially if Marquez stayed on by that point, the gap it really, really, really grows, and we have to talk about the rider who will be most worried about that gap right now, because coming into the season, it was supposed to be Marc versus teammate Pecco Bagnaia. Bagnaia is, again, 51 points down. I think under the old MotoGP system, it would have been like 32-33. I think the equivalent of that. And obviously, Pecco Bagnaia has historically come back from 91 points back under the old system. But the metrics are worrying. Everything is worrying. Everything sounds bad. Everything looks rough, even before Le Mans sort of didn't go his way. He got unlucky at Le Mans, but there's also part of him not making his luck generally this season. He's been out-qualified by Marc in every round so far. Very frequently, it's been by a decently considerable margins. He's not really had an answer in any of the sprints. And we've not really seen conclusive evidence on Sunday of him suddenly having an answer to that Marc used tire burst of pace. Now, Pecco Bagnaia has spoken a lot about a lack of ease with the front of the newer specification of the Ducati, even despite the fact that the changes aren't as significant as they were supposed to be. Obviously, they discarded a lot of the stuff. We've heard also Fabio Di Giannantonio, fellow 2025 Spec Ducati rider, also slight front unease. And clearly there's something to the difference between what the 25 guys are running and the 24 guys are running. How much of that for you explains the situation that Bagnaia is in? And how much of it is just he's come up against Marc Marquez and he knew this was going to be hard, but perhaps maybe didn't realize how hard.
I mean, fundamentally, that's the difference. It's that he's not competing against a Fabio Quartararo and a Yamaha that's seemingly getting worse race by race. He's competing against Marc Marquez on exactly the same machinery. And that's always, we have historically seen that everyone who tries to compete against Marquez on the same machinery is at a disadvantage because he's so much more talented. And I don't think that's an insult to anyone else in the grid to say that, this rider who's vying for the greatest of all time contender is more talented. The thing that we'll be trying to keep, the Pecco Bagnaia will be trying to tell himself to keep himself sane at this point, is that it should be closer. And that there is an element of this that has been somewhat taken out of his hands. I mean, he should have probably won in Le Mans without all the craziness and everything that went on around him, because he was faster in those conditions and he had made the right strategy call. It wasn't to be, and there's no point in talking about what could have been, because at the end of the day, that doesn't matter anymore. The points are on the table. But that's the sort of thing he's going to have to be using to kind of reassure himself that it's not over yet. But I mean, while he continues to have these difficulties with the GP25, and while he continues to not feel comfortable with the bike, it's hard to see any world in which he can massively turn this thing around and start to close down the gap to Marquez. It looks very much like the guys who came straight from a GP23 onto a GP25, that is Marquez and Fabio Di Giannantonio, didn't quite understand what Bagnaia was talking about initially, about this difference. But now they've started to kind of realize that he was onto something, that he knows that this bike is not as good as the GP24. And you wonder maybe if they'd had a little bit of experience of the GP24 instead of coming from the GP23, if we would have seen a slightly different bike starting the season, or if there would just have been 6 GP24s in the grid right now, and Bagnaia would be in a much better place and looking a lot more comfortable. He's still making, what is essentially his best ever start to a MotoGP season. It's just that it's up against Marc Marquez, who's on a roll, who has the momentum behind him at this point, even despite those errors. And there has to be a point coming pretty soon where Bagnaia essentially concedes that this is a year to finish second in the championship, because otherwise, how do you beat Marc Marquez? The reassuring thing for him is probably that it's maybe closer than a lot of people expected, despite everything that has gone on for Bagnaia. And there's probably a little bit of hope in his mind there that means at least in 2026 with a changed bike, he can fight a bit closer and it can be a bit different. But it's looking like 2025 might be done and dusted for, essentially everyone apart from Marc Marquez at this point.
Yeah, I mean, we should always say, injuries happen, easy to break a collarbone and suddenly the title race changes. But in the current performance picture, yeah, it looks rough. I think the one gap that is definitely smaller that we all expected, even coming out of Le Mans, is Alex Marquez and how close he's running Marc still in the standings. I mean, 22 points is not much of anything. And it, as you speak about the GP24, GP25 thing, and we've always assumed, I think, or at least had it at the back of our head, and certainly Alex does whenever he speaks, that this might end, that they might sort out the newer bike and suddenly you don't really have a chance. But I think there is also a possibility from what we've seen historically with Ducatis that sometimes the year-old bikes stay good until the very end. I think because we've seen Fabio Di Giannantonio, for instance, take his first win on a year-old bike at the end of the season in Qatar. It happens. It can be possible. But can you see it being enough for Alex Marquez to take the distance?
I mean, we've seen similar circumstances before where the newest generation of factory Ducati isn't the best bike. Mm-hmm. It isn't as strong as they'd hoped for. And as a result, the year-old bike can be quite competitive against it. We've seen this happen previously. And I think there's an element of that happening this year that's going to definitely keep Alex Marquez fast until, right through the season, essentially, because, in an almost exact copy of the Di Giannantonio circumstance, there are races at the end of this season that suit Alex Marquez really well, and where you would expect him to win, like Sepang. Exactly like Di Giannantonio was in that position, with Qatar being an unusual time of the season, and it being, traditionally one of his strongest circuits. So There will definitely be Alex Marquez strengths all the way through this year, but I mean, I've never been convinced of the Alex Marquez title hopes. We've spoken about this before in the podcast. I think that he has traditionally been a rider who is very, very quick, but has an element of inconsistency to him. I think we've seen flashes of that already this year. We've seen the occasional kind of tailing off or just random moment that is quite like, ooh, Alex, don't do that. And kind of hints that there's some recklessness to come
it's
later
not been
in
a
the
lot,
year.
but
Let's put it that way.
It's enough because the margins are so thin against Mark that it's not a lot, but even not a lot is enough.
Exactly. And I think that, while he's going to have the best season of his life, it's not going to be enough to come close to challenging his brother for the title. And realistically, I don't think once things start to click into pace, close enough to really challenge Bagnaia for second. I think we're still going to have the championship standings we roughly expected at the end of this year, which is 2 factory Ducatis at the front and then a fairly close battle for third behind them.